Hello, I'm Michael Parker, and welcome to Antidote. Today we're going to discuss the most controversial film of the year, about one of the most controversial subjects of the last couple decades. The film is called Vaxxed. I'm joined in the studio today by producer Dale Bigtree and director Andrew Wakefield. Gentlemen, good morning. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you for coming on. I viewed the film twice, and I've been aware of the story for quite some time. And the first thing that I would like to do, because we're going to have quite a bit of time to talk about the entire film, but there's a couple of things that I want to address right off the bat. And my first question is going to go to you, Dale.
Okay.
In this town, in Hollywood, if there's one thing that people believe and respect and listen to, that is success. And you have had that. You are an Emmy award-winning television producer on a medical journalism show, The Doctors. You had 6 seasons of that. As far as I can tell, it's a hit.
Yeah.
So why would you walk away from that to do a film as potentially explosive as this, with this gentleman next to you, who some have called a fraud, a charlatan, a hoaxer? The litany of things that have been said about Dr. Wakefield go on and on and on. The internet is full of it. What did you discover about this man that made you confident, you know what, I'm on board, we're going to do this?
Yeah, well, first of all, the story about Dr. William Thompson, which is what this film is really about, yes. A whistleblower at the CDC that came forward and said that they basically threw out data, manipulated data, kicked kids off of a study, just committed one of the most egregious forms of scientific medical fraud we've ever seen on the MMR autism study. Looking into that story, that was an extremely important story to tell. Millions of children are in harm's way. It's clear that this MMR vaccine has a link to autism. So we know one of the potential causes of autism now in this country, which is a skyrocketing epidemic. So that's why I got in. I got in because as a medical journalist, it's always important to me to tell important medical stories. That's what brought me to it. But you're right. I mean, once I looked into that story, and Andy was the one working with Brian Hooker. He was the one that was already working on the documentary. He had years and years of the sort of the investigation behind all of this. So I had to say, well, am I going to work with Andy Wakefield? I mean, this is a guy that clearly, I had all the bumper sticker slogans, baby killer, father of the anti-vaccine movement, the list goes on and on. So that was where my research began, was just what is this story around Andy, and is it true or not? And as soon as you really start looking at the Lancet paper, which is what this is all about, Andy Wakefield had 12 co-authors on a paper, which I think is the first thing I'd like to point out. They say the Andy Wakefield fraud, Andy Wakefield put together all this fraudulent data and published it in a paper and got it published in the Lancet. Well, they all leave out the fact that there was 12 co-authors on this paper, some of the top scientific minds in the world in their different departments, and they were a part of the entire study. So to call it an Andy Wakefield fraud, you really have to ask, if he was using fraudulent data, how did he get 12 of the top scientific minds in the world to sign off on it? I mean, that's, those are the big things that start to just unravel as you look at it. Also, they said that the paper, proved a link between the MMR vaccine and autism, that Andy Wakefield was the one that discovered that the MMR causes autism, and by saying that in his fraudulent paper, and then you look at it and you realize the paper really has nothing to do specifically with the MMR and autism. This was a study really looking at a gastrointestinal problem. These were 12 families that brought their children forward saying, Andy was a gastroenterologist, so they went to Andy saying, look, we've seen your hundreds of, over 100 papers written on different gastrointestinal issues. It started with one mother contacting Andy and saying, my son has major gastrointestinal problems, and he has autism. And Andy's response was, I know nothing about autism. You must have called the wrong number. She says, no, I've read your study on Crohn's disease, and what you're describing really sounds like what my son is going through. Doubled over in pain, constipation for days, or diarrhea, just all sorts of real issues. So that's where the study began. The study was really about, was there a novel intestinal disease or problem that went along with autism. That's what the Lancet paper is really all about. So when people say it was about the autism being caused by the MMR vaccine, not true. How that came about was 8 of the 12 families in their sort of talking about their story, and as in this paper, as they sort of interviewed everybody involved with these children to figure out to get to the bottom of it, 8 of the 12 families, parents said, my child's autism began right after receiving the MMR vaccine. And it's important to also point out in the UK, that was the only vaccine they get that day. Here in the United States, sometimes you get the MMR with other vaccines, so it'd be hard to sort of figure out what was the problem. But in the UK, they received the MMR vaccine, and the parents all had the same story. That night or soon after that vaccine, fevers, seizures, lost the ability to walk, lost the ability to talk, descended into what we now know as autism. So the paper was really about this gastrointestinal disease, and they did find that there was a connection, that when and Andy can talk about this, of course, but when they would clear the gut to get ready for the colonoscopies to see what's happening in the intestines, many of the mannerisms to autism would lessen or disappear. And so these were like things that they said, there's a real link between the intestinal issue and autism. That's what the paper was about. But this side note that parents were blaming the MMR for autism, that had to be put in the paper. And I think, when Andy talks about it, and looking into it, Andy, the other 12 scientists weren't crazy about putting this element into the paper. They said, look, this is really supposed to be about the gut and autism, and these parents mentioning the MMR as the cause for autism is going to cause some conflict. We know it is. We have pharmaceutical sponsors for the school that we work for, and it's going to hurt the Ministry of Health. So the reason I point this out is then Andy said to those 12 scientists, well, look if the parents had said our child had measles and right after measles descended into autism, we'd put that in the paper, wouldn't we? Be very important to the story. They said, of course. So then the only reason we're not going to mention the MMR vaccine is because we're worried about our pharmaceutical sponsors and we're worried about the Ministry of Health and what this will do to a vaccine program. And they all agreed and said, you know what, that's a good point. So we have to put it in. The reason I raise this is when you think about these scientists signing off on this paper, if there was fraudulent data in there, imagine you had 12 scientists now that know that they don't like this MMR issue. They know it's going to create a huge buzz. They're going to be attacked. So now you have 12 paranoid scientists combing through every word that's in this paper in the end, revising it, sending edits. When they signed their name to it, I assure you, they had dotted every I, crossed every T. That's the truth about the paper. And so that's where, once I really looked at that data, and you could go on and on. I mean, there's a lot of things thrown at this paper that would be a full book, and Andy's written a very good book about it. And
to be fair, on the Vaxxed website, I don't want to belabor the point, we'll sum this up. There is a very nice 20-minute interview that Dr. Wakefield addresses all of the issues surrounding the controversy. And to your credit, you have always defended your work and refuted the claims. So I just wanted to get it out there because a lot of people, they would just be like, well, wait a minute, all I've ever heard is how this is a fraud and a hoax. And really, I think people don't know what they don't know. I'm going to move on. My next question is for Dr. Wakefield, Andy, if I may call you that. And that is about, and then we'll move to the film, but this is about autism itself. Autism, at least to me, from what I can gather, seems to be a mystery. And if we can bring up that graph that shows this spike in autism over the last several decades, prior to 1930, autism, extremely rare. Clearly, as evidenced in this, it's skyrocketing. At one point in the film, you have a statistician, her name is Dr. Stephanie Seneff, and she says that if this goes on in its current path, by 2032, we have 1 in 2 children with autism. 80% of all males will have autism. My question to you is, if we don't know where autism comes from, and that's what I'm gathering from science, we don't really know where it comes from, then how can we just logically exclude any form of external factors from being related to autism, since it's obviously coming from somewhere and it's going straight up?
This is what we hear from the media, isn't it? We don't know what causes autism, but we know that vaccines don't. And it's actually a very straightforward story. It's not complex at all. Autism isn't this enigma. It's the disease of the last 100 years. It's appeared, it's gone from vanishingly low levels to now, as you say, potentially affecting 1 in 2 children by 2032. That is the most alarming epidemic that we've ever seen. I mean, it is absolutely extraordinary and will destroy the economy, will destroy the social infrastructure of this country and other countries around the world. I was looking at India just the other day. 1 in 66 children in India now have autism. They didn't even have a word for autism before. It suddenly appeared out of nowhere. Now, the questions that have been raised about this, or the issues that have been put forward by the psychiatrists and psychologists, the experts, is that it's not a new disease. It's always been there. We just didn't recognize it. Or we're changing the diagnostic criteria, and children we historically called mentally retarded are now being called autistic, or we're just getting better at making the diagnosis. Now, those are reasonable ideas. They've been tested, and they're not true. It's important to bear in mind that the best diagnosticians in the history of medicine are not of this century or the last century, but of the century before. So, for example, like Charcot or Tourette, the great French physicians of the late 18th century. So, had autism existed, it would have been described. Now, go back to the clinical history, because this is the key. If you do not know the cause of the disease, listen to the patient or the patient's parents, because they will give you the clues. And the parents were saying they weren't anti-vaccine, they took their children to be vaccinated on time, but this is what happened to their child. They regressed into autism following the MMR vaccine. Now, we had to take that extremely seriously. They were right about the bowel disease. The medical profession was almost to a man and a woman wrong and said there's no problem, it's just autism. So when they were right about the bowel disease, we have to take the association with the MMR vaccine extremely seriously. And I believe that after all of the investigations we've done, they were right. And medicine says, well, parents are just looking for something to blame. No, they're not. Medicine is looking for something to blame. Medicine historically blamed the parents. It was the refrigerator mother who the child wanted to die because the mother was ice cold and hated them. This was the medical perception of autism in the very beginning. And then it was genetic. It was the parents' fault again. No, it's not genetic. You don't have genetic epidemics. And now the medical profession is trying to exonerate vaccines and blaming the parents again for themselves, looking for something to blame. So it's this circuitous argument that in fact comes down to the medical profession not having the answers and blaming the parents for the problem.
Understood. Let's move to the film itself. As promised, we're going to spend the remainder of the show on the film and the subject at hand. Like I say, I've watched the film twice. I want our audience, because here, first of all, the people who haven't seen the film, they may think that this is A, an anti-vax film, and B, it's about Andy Wakefield. It's not an anti-vax film, and it's not about Andrew Wakefield. You are in the film, and you make commentary, and you direct it, but it is not about you. So let's talk about who and what it is about. And what it is about is a person within the CDC. This is no bullshit, folks. This is real. There is a man within the CDC who is a whistleblower. His name is Dr. William Thompson. Gentlemen, tell me what this man did and what he knew.
William Thompson is a senior scientist, a statistician and epidemiologist who was put in charge of 3 vaccine safety studies at the CDC. He was extremely well respected and highly published in his field. He was put in charge of an MMR autism study which looked at the association between age of exposure to MMR and autism risk. Was the younger you got the vaccine a risk for autism? That is the hypothesis they tested. In 2001, they had the answer was yes. There is a very strong association between early MMR vaccine on the CDC schedule and autism risk, and that is what they hid. Now, he, at the time, had major concerns. He's a scientist. He brought those concerns to his fellow authors and to his seniors at the CDC, and they not only ignored him, but did everything in their power to obscure that effect. He lived with that knowledge for 14 years, and eventually his conscience got the better of him, and he came forward to a friend and colleague, Dr. Brian Hooker, the father of an affected child, and said, "We have committed fraud, and here is the evidence."
Dr. Brian Hooker had reached out to the CDC prior, I think going back as far as 2000 or
yeah, I think right around 2000.
And you know, he was getting the runaround, so he's filing Freedom of Information Act requests, and he had even spoken to Dr. Thompson a few times. So now we fast forward to 2013, and he receives this call out of the blue from William Thompson, and William Thompson offers to Brian Hooker, who is a scientist, environmental
scientist. I mean, I think the thing to point out with Brian is, just like all of these parents, he was extremely pro-vaccine. In fact, his mother, you know, worked in the field of promoting vaccines in this country. So when he watched his child get injured by a vaccine, you know, in the late 1990s, he immediately started researching the CDC. As a fellow scientist, he just contacted those scientists directly and said, let me see the data. I want to look at the data and how it's being used. And the gentleman they put him in touch with then was Dr. William Thompson. They said, Thompson, why don't you take care of this Brian Hooker, the scientist, and give him whatever he needs. Then they found out that he was really looking into what's causing autism, and they sent basically a cease and desist letter back in the in early 2000s saying, we're no longer going to provide you with any more evidence or any of the things that you're asking for. So then he was stuck, you know, trying to use Freedom of Information Act ways to get it out. And so imagine 10 years later, this gentleman you were talking to, Dr. William Thompson, calls him and says, look at Brian, I know what you're looking for. I know what you're looking for, and if you listen very closely to me and do exactly what I say, I can get you that information that you're looking for. And what Dr. Thompson knew was there's a loophole inside of the CDC, something that nobody knew about, a citizen's request that had sort of legally binds them to put out the information being requested. So FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, was not the way to go. And so he told Brian how to write the email, how to send it in. And what ultimately happened was Brian started submitting these requests, and he found out that inside, Thompson was taking all of this data that the CDC had destroyed. He'd kept copies himself. But he talks about his fellow authors sat in a room, they brought a garbage can in and said, destroy everything so there's no proof. He secretly kept copies. And so when Brian made these requests to the CDC, Thompson was taking this and it was legally getting out. Because imagine, Dr. Thompson's a government employee. He doesn't work for the tobacco industry or anything like this. So it could be considered treasonous. I mean, these are classified documents, except that he used this legal loophole to legally, well, it's been requested, and then got this data out of the CDC where he'd had it locked away and got it into Brian Hooker's hands.
Which, had he not made copies, they wouldn't have existed even if he wanted to get that information.
We would have no proof of the fraud that took place at the CDC. But what we have is proof of fraud that took place. And that's really important. This film, just as you said, they say it's anti-vaccine. It is not anti-vaccine, but how can we have healthy, safe vaccines if the most important health agency in this country is covering up the fact when we have a defective vaccine that's destroying the lives of children? That's what I discovered. That's what Andy was already working on. So as a medical journalist, that is so extremely disturbing because I'd worked with the CDC. I counted on the CDC, as every doctor does. Every doctor believes that the CDC is the most credible health agency. If you need information, that's where you go. To discover that they're covering up a defective vaccine, committing fraud to hide the fact that MMR's product is hurting, that Merck's product is hurting children. Where do we go from there?
They're just people. They are not this infallible edifice that we had hoped they were or trusted them to be. So let's talk about, what did this evidence show? What is the anomalies that were uncovered that they wanted to just completely get rid of?
Well, first of all, what they showed is that in the initial analysis of the data that Thompson did, he found that there was a link in the entire population, between early MMR vaccine and autism compared with children receiving their vaccine after 36 months. So if you got it on the CDC schedule between 12 and 18 months, you were at a significant risk of autism compared with children who got it later. And then having found that, they decided that they were going to change their analysis plan. They were going to go back after the fact when they'd found something they didn't like, and they were going to change the analysis plan to exclude a large proportion of the children so they could reduce the statistical power of the study, hopefully just to make it go away, which is what they did.
Numbers.
Absolutely. So they then omitted data from the paper, hard numbers confirming the link, and they omitted it for two groups of children. One is African American boys. That was the first analysis that Hooker did and confirmed. And the second one was for children of all races who were developmentally normal to 1 year of age. So that's a lot of children. Children who didn't have any mental retardation or birth defects or other associated problems. Exactly the population, as Thompson says himself, in whom you'd expect to find this association. They were normal, something hit them, and they regressed. They disappeared. So they then decided, as Dell said, to destroy the documents. Let's cover this over so no one can ever trace this back. Thompson knew that that was illegal. It was a destruction of federal documents. It was a felony, and the Department of Justice and FOIA requests were after these documents. They then went to the Institute of Medicine, a scientific body in America that advises the government on vaccine safety research, and they said, MMR vaccine is safe. Carry on as usual. The IOM, the Institute of Medicine, then wrote a report which said we should, not only is it safe, but there should be no further funding for looking at this Autism Vaccine Association. So they cut off the funding channels to look any further into this issue. The IOM's report went before the vaccine court in this country, where there were 5,000 children plaintiffs looking for compensation as directed by Congress for their autism caused, in this case, by vaccines. Those cases were thrown out en bloc, in large part because of the fraudulent data presented to the Institute of Medicine. So there was an obstruction of justice. So this goes from a simple fraud, if that's what one might, right the way through to various felonies and obstruction of justice. This is a criminal act and is really the most egregious, the most serious fraud that we've ever witnessed in the history of medicine.
And meanwhile, the MMR was still given to children with no issues assigned to it, that it just went on and on.
That's right. They had a choice, and their choice was to say, right, we will not only do a much bigger, more extensive study of this right now, having found this, but we will delay MMR vaccination till after 36 months to make it safer. An abundance of caution. They did neither of those two things. They decided to hide the data.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is the study that we all point to in the medical industry. As a medical journalist, when we say vaccines are safe, this is the study we point to, because this was the last study ever done, ever funded by the United States government, looking at are vaccines causing autism. So
this is the last one.
This is the last one done, and we're talking 10 years ago. So I hear people say, we shouldn't put any more money into looking at vaccines causing autism. That's wasting money. We should put it somewhere else. The truth is it hasn't been there. The money's been going everywhere else but vaccines. Meanwhile, it continues to skyrocket. We have one of the worst epidemics in the country, in the world, and the CDC's official statement right now to the public is, we don't know what's causing autism. I mean, that's really scary. And then the fact that, you know, we never talk about that. Why is none of our news stations talking about this epidemic that's claiming now 1 in 45 children? When you talk to doctors that are working specifically in this field, they believe we may be at 1 in 25 children being born now or ending up on the autism spectrum. Meanwhile, on our news, they'll scream and yell about 120 people in California that got measles.
Right.
You know, or 644 people in the entire country that got measles. I mean, think about that. 644 people out of 320 million? That's a 1 in 450,000 chance of getting measles. And they'll scream about that day after day after day, saying, be terrified of measles. Meanwhile, all those people are perfectly healthy now, doing just fine. Half of them were vaccinated with the MMR. They don't want to talk about that. But what I'm pointing out is they're using this fear of measles to push this MMR vaccine on everybody. Meanwhile, it very well may be one of the major causes of an epidemic that's now at 1 in 25 children. You know, we're spinning, it's Russian roulette now with our babies. So it's an incredible fraud. And as Andy said, it goes beyond just a fraud. It's injuring children every day. Every 7 minutes, a child is being diagnosed with autism now in this country. And what people really need to ask themselves is, why have I not heard about that? Why is no one telling me that our children are in this much danger?
there is clearly a press and media embargo on this story, and it doesn't take a genius to figure out how that would happen. The pharmaceutical industry, I mean, I can't turn on a television show without being bombarded with ads about something that's going to make my penis stronger or not have allergies or do this or make me happier and I'm going to lay in a field of wheat. Meanwhile, half of that commercial is given over to this long list of things that could happen to me. All these side effects, so it belies logic to think, well, wait a minute. If all of these drugs have this long list of side effects, why would a vaccine not have side effects? Not only that, I'm an old guy, I've been around quite a while. I don't remember ever going to a doctor and them not asking me, are you allergic to penicillin? So clearly the idea of injecting something into a human body, there could be effects as a result of that.
There are always effects. There is no one size fits all. Every race, every age, every human body type is different. And that's really where we run into issues here, specifically in laws that mandate vaccines without choice. Can you imagine if you mandated everyone in the country has to have penicillin, and we don't care that some of them die? I mean, is that really what we're going to say? We don't care. Penicillin's so great that we're going to accept the casualty of all the deaths that that's going to create. That's what they're saying with vaccines. We don't care that children get injured. We don't care that children die. That's just the cost of doing business. And that really, that's at the heart of all of this. That cannot be the case. Our country cannot mandate something that we know destroys children. We just can't do that. That's not what we represent. And you're absolutely right. The connection between the commercials we see, I think this is something that people really don't understand. I think they watch these commercials, they don't understand how TV works. They don't know how media works. When we see those pharmaceutical ads, every commercial break, you have to understand that that commercial ad is paying Sanjay Gupta's salary.
Absolutely.
That's paying Rachel Maddow's salary.
Yes.
That's, and I'm not to single anyone out. It was paying my salary. As working on the Doctor's television show, we have to adhere to certain things that our sponsors, that's our boss. My boss may be an executive producer that's telling, us what we should put in the show and what's rating and what's not. But ultimately, the final decision is made by the sponsors. If you do something out of line from what the sponsors want, they threaten to pull their funding from your show. And then it's over. So everyone's aware of that. So all of our news stations now are being controlled by the pharmaceutical industry. That's not a conspiracy theory, that's a fact.
Yeah.
And so when you think about what news, let's just imagine for a second that what we're saying is true. That's all. I mean, I get it. Some people go, this just sounds outrageous. But think about it. If you had a fraudulent, defective vaccine, and someone like us was trying to get that information out to you, just like Watergate or any story that a journalist breaks, if we're trying to get you that story, how are we going to do it when every news station is being controlled by the very industry we're calling out? That's what we're up against. And it's
see the film.
See the film.
Now we've found a mechanism for getting it out
right
there, and the film speaks for itself. It's not our opinion. It's not about me or Dell or Polly or anyone else. It's about the whistleblower from the CDC giving us the facts. It's about facts. We're delivering people the facts and showing them the documents, showing them what was said, when it was said, whom it was said by. So go and watch the film, and people will then begin to understand what they're not hearing in the network TV shows, because there is so much of it that they really, really need to understand, particularly going forward with mandatory vaccine bills sweeping the country that are in effect being written by the pharmaceutical industry.
Dr. Wakefield, we're going to return to that, and we're going to talk about that towards the end because California is ground zero for that. One thing I wanted to say about this is that, well, two things. If the vaccines are not related to autism, it seems like one of the easiest things that one could do, or the CDC could do, would be to do a test between vaccinated children and unvaccinated children and see what the responses are. As far as I know, that's never happened. Has anyone ever done that?
No, it has never been done. It was mandated by Congress as a baseline for the safety evaluation of these vaccines. Let's compare the long-term health outcomes of fully vaccinated versus unvaccinated children as a baseline for safety. Never done. The CDC has refused to do this study. It falls upon private organizations and philanthropists to do that. Fortunately, at the moment, it is being done. Certain pilot studies have been done which clearly show that there is an excess risk of long-term adverse health outcomes in those who've received vaccines compared with those who haven't. But this needs to be done in a formal setting, and that is being done at the moment. Beyond that, I'm not part of those studies, so I can't say anything more about them, but hopefully we'll have an answer quite soon. Right,
but the problem, I think, what we're up against is these studies are being done privately or even by large universities and medical bodies, but you have to get that published into a journal, a medical journal. And none of the medical journals will publish a vaxxed versus unvaxxed study. So again, you see just think about the power of the pharmaceutical industry. It's now the most powerful lobby in Washington. It has more money than almost any industry in the world, and gaining finances as it mandates more and more of its products on people. It's invested in every university that teaches medicine and a part of developing their curriculum. It's invested in the medical journals and telling them
interests.
Right. So I mean, you have to hand it to the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, it's a brilliant business plan. No one can move against you. But the things that people need to understand is when I got involved in this, I assumed the vaccines were being tested the same way every drug we take is. You know, we all have a basic scientific understanding from high school that a safety test means we take half a group that takes a drug and we take the other half that's given a placebo, a saltwater tablet or something where they think they're taking the drug, and then we see is there more adverse side effects with the group that took the product versus the ones that didn't. That's basic science. When you discover that vaccines aren't going through that process at all, it's shocking. We're not doing long-term safety studies on vaccines. We're not doing real placebo-based studies on vaccines. Basically, the vaccine only has to show it can create antibodies for whatever it's going for. Forget if it causes cancer. Forget if it causes autism. Forget if it causes ADD, ADHD, childhood leukemia, diabetes. We're not looking at any of that. And that's, every other drug has to go and make sure that that's happening. You can't just throw Viagra on the market. They had to make sure that it doesn't cause cancer, doesn't have other side effects. And they're getting away with this because they've put vaccines in a totally different category. They call it a biologic instead of a pharmaceutical drug. So one of the requests that we'll talk about later in the film, though, is we want vaccines considered to be pharmaceutical drugs so that this product we're injecting into sometimes a one-day-old baby, we just want it to be tested just as much as the Viagra grandpa's taking. I don't think that that's too much to ask. Yet the pharmaceutical industry will fight tooth and nail to make sure we don't test these vaccines. And you have to ask yourselves why. And this vaxxed versus unvaxxed study, I mean, think about it. Almost every chiropractor in the country isn't vaccinating their child. There's these different groups. We know that you could just go to them and say, we'd like to just study your unvaccinated children. And there's one simple question. Are all of the unvaccinated children in this country experiencing autism at a 1 in 45 rate? Very simple question, very simple study, probably take about 7 days, and we'd have the answer. And you have to ask yourself, why does the CDC refuse to do that very, very simple study?
And I'll take it one step farther. If age of exposure to the MMR vaccine is linked to autism, you have to, and I'm thinking out loud, the CDC could change their vaccination schedule, but am I correct in thinking that if they did that, it would be clear admission of guilt?
Yes, it would. I mean, it would be when you're taking a product that you are going to inject into healthy children, not only inject but mandate for healthy children, you have to go above and beyond. You have to be absolutely certain it is as safe as it possibly can be. You apply an abundance of caution to that product. So if you find something like they found, you say, right, on the basis of what we found, we are now going to change our policy and displace the age of MMR vaccine up to 36 months and beyond. Even if there isn't a risk, we found something that suggests there may be, and if we protect children by doing that, then while we're finding out the real answer, we'll move the age of vaccination up. But of course, as you say, that would be a clear admission that there was a problem, and they have to be faultless. Their word has to be the final word. And if they are found to be wrong or questionable, then they believe that public confidence in all of their decisions, all of their policies will fall away. Well, it will. And it will because it's now been exposed that they've been lying. And so in the end, the greatest enemies of public health policy in this country and of their own vaccination policy are the CDC themselves.
You know, I know you want to go, but I want to talk about something we haven't mentioned much about, and that's the fact that people say, are you saying the CDC is this evil empire and blah, blah, blah. What we're saying, you have to understand what the CDC is. It was designed to promote vaccines in this country. Their #1 priority is to make sure that every child and every adult in this country is vaccinated appropriately. So that's their job, promoting vaccines. Now, when you give them the job of then testing whether they're safe or not, you have a massive conflict of interest. Do I think there was some great evil going on? Look, when they clearly saw that there was this issue with the MMR vaccine, they had to be thinking, geez, if we tell the public, if we show weakness on the MMR vaccine, if we say this one's not safe, they're going to question all the others. And we're going against our first job is to make sure everyone believes that these are safe, that everyone is staying vaccinated. So they had a massive conflict of interest. I can't imagine what those decisions were like, but how do we go forward with this fraud or with this defective vaccine, because it's going to hurt our #1 job, which is promoting vaccines. So it's very possible that they just, based on that, said, let's just cover this up. Let's hope it just stays a small problem. Maybe we'll just hurt a few children and we can all move on. It'll be the greater good, the good of all. I'm sure no one predicted that we would be skyrocketing to a place where at some point we're going to hit 1 in 2 children. Okay? This thing's gotten out of hand. It's sort of like you threw your cigarette out the window and, you know, small crime, then it starts a forest fire and burns cities down. You're like, oh, geez.
Right.
So how do they come forward now? How do they admit it now? Now they're caught they're continuing to lie in front of the Congress. They continue to cover this up. It's gotten out of control. So was this some evil, diabolical plan? Probably not. This is the problem when you give 2 different opposing jobs to one group. That's why our main decision here, what we want to see happen is we want to see vaccine testing taken away from the CDC. Let the CDC continue to promote vaccines as it's supposed to, but we need to create a totally independent testing body that is firewalled against any industry, firewalled against a fear that it's going to somehow affect the vaccine, work, and just really look at safety testing on every single vaccine, how they interact with each other. As we said, tested just like pharmaceutical drugs. This has to happen now, because too many children are being injured. We have the sickest children in the industrialized world. I just saw 4 days ago, I think it was, CBS came out with this story, that we now have more day 1 infant deaths, meaning your baby dies the first day it's alive, than any other industrialized nation in the world. 50% more than all of the industrial countries put together. So you have to ask yourself, with the great hospitals we have, the United States of America has the greatest medical system known to man, why are we having more babies die on day 1? Well, then you look at, geez, we're the only group injecting a Hep B, a sexually transmitted disease, into a baby on its first day of life. Hello, welcome to the world. Here's your first breath. We're going to inject you with a sexually transmitted disease you wouldn't even come in contact with until you're sexually active or somehow get a drug problem where you're using needles. So we got to look at the sense of this. We're not against vaccines, but we have to have a logical vaccine program, and every vaccine has to prove to be safe. And clearly, that's not happening.
Yeah, we've heard from time and time again, we've heard from NICU nurses, neonatal intensive care unit nurses who've said, I need to tell you that what's happening is that when children are getting infants, premature infants, unhealthy infants are getting their hepatitis B vaccines and other vaccines on our NICU, we are ready for them to code. We are already there waiting for them to go into cardiac or respiratory arrest because it happens so frequently. Will you say that on camera? No, I can't, because my job depends on it. Time and time again.
They'll get a call, get a bed ready, we're about to vaccinate a preemie. I mean, think about it. This is a baby that hasn't even developed correctly. And they go, still, day 1, that's the mandate. Here we go. Hep B vaccine into a baby that is struggling to survive. This is the insanity that's going on in this country.
Gentlemen, in our remaining minutes, because we just have a few, listen, there's this thing called the... Ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't heard of this, you need to look it up and you need to know about this. I've covered it on my show before. The 1986 National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act and the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program and a vaccine court. I ask you, if vaccines didn't injure people, you wouldn't need all this, right?
Right.
So what is this?
It's very simple. In 1986, the pharmaceutical industry basically blackmailed the government. They said, we're getting sued so much for injuries on children from our vaccines that we're going to stop making vaccines. They said this to President Reagan. We're going to stop making vaccines unless you protect us from liability, from lawsuit. And so Ronald Reagan signed the 1986 Vaccine Injury Compensation Act, and what it did was said you can no longer ever sue a pharmaceutical industry if their vaccine product injures your child or yourself. Instead, we're going to tax every vaccine, we're going to put it in a bank account, and every child that gets injured will go through this quasi-court called a vaccine court, and you'll show up and we'll just pay your children out. It was supposed to be a non-adversarial court where basically you bring your child in their wheelchair or whatever state you can get from the court to show, look at what the vaccine did to my child, and you would get paid. It's become much more difficult, and as Andy said, this MMR study was used to kick every child that was claiming that the autism was caused by the MMR vaccine. They used this study to say, nope, that's not true. Look at the study, and 5,000 children got kicked out of this vaccine court. Their parents are stuck with a $5 million bill. The CDC says it costs $5 million to raise a child with autism. So now the parents have to fend for themselves. The government won't step up and say, geez, even though it happened and started the day after that vaccine, we don't care. This paper proves it, this fraudulent paper proves it. But think about the future cost for the United States of America. If you don't think this issue is going to affect you, my child's healthy, I don't have to worry about it. Think about the education system. We're watching honors classes disappear as we're watching these special needs classes explode in every single school. Sports programs are being sucked up so that these special needs children can have single teachers for each one of them or every 2 kids. We can't afford this. And then think about $5 million per child. There's now 1 million children that have been diagnosed with autism since this fraudulent paper came out, this fraudulent study saying this vaccine's safe. Multiply 1 million children times $5 million. Do you think is there an insurance program that can cover that? Who's going to pay for that? And this year alone, over 100,000 children born will ultimately be diagnosed with autism. That means we're building cities of autistic children. They're going to be autism adults, and the United States taxpayer, it's going to bankrupt us. And when you look at this and you say, oh my God, this is a man-made disease and we could stop this, and we're not because we're more concerned with the interests of a pharmaceutical industry, an industry we cannot sue. I mean, it's so corrupt.
And think about the business model for the industry.
It's brilliant for them.
It's brilliant. There's no liability, maximum profits, mandated vaccines, and so let's put as many vaccines as we can into the system, get them approved on the schedule, and we have no liability at all. There are some 270 new vaccines in the pipeline. So if you think this doesn't affect you, then you better watch out.
Gentlemen, we have to wrap this up, but the one thing that I want to leave the audience with, and ladies and gentlemen, we are going to play the trailer at the very end of the film. I wanted to do it after our conversation, so I encourage you to watch it. But the one thing that I wanted to leave us with, and first of all, thank you, gentlemen, for coming on, because I really wanted to do this show, and it meant a lot to me. You have some action points at the end of the film. Let's talk about what those 4 action points are as we get out of here.
The first thing we want to do is we want to have every single member of this great country, every citizen in this country needs to contact their congressperson and say, I want the CDC fraud investigated, the MMR fraud investigated immediately. Dr. William Thompson has been waiting for 1.5 years after stepping forward and saying we're committing fraud in here in the CDC. He needs to be subpoenaed by Congress. We need to demand that our congressional representatives all do exactly that. That's our first demand. Secondly, we want to see a repeal of the 1986 Vaccine Injury Compensation Act, because this industry is going to ultimately, it's causing a problem. It's going to cost taxpayers trillions of dollars. We think that should be the responsibility of the pharmaceutical industry that created the problem, not taxpayers that have been lied to by the CDC.
And the human tragedy associated.
Absolutely. And then third, we would really like to see the MMR vaccine broken up, separated into single measles, single mumps, single rubella. That's all that Andy Wakefield ever requested in the Lancet paper. He was never anti-vaccine, like everyone has said. If you actually go and look at this, you look at the statements made after the paper, which simply said, the Lancet paper said this does not prove a causal relationship between this vaccine and autism. More research needs to be done. But in light of that, Andy said to the world, continue to use a single measles vaccine in order to protect yourself against measles, because we never had anyone complaining that the single measles vaccine caused autism. So it's very simple. We think that that's a safer way to go, and so we'd like to see every parent that wants a single vaccine like that to be allowed to get that. Currently, Merck is not allowing that into the public because they lose the patent, they lose the monopoly over measles in this country if it happens. It's sort of like a generic, all of a sudden every pharmaceutical industry can come and make that vaccine. And then lastly, we would like to see all vaccines categorized as pharmaceutical drugs. Take them out of biologics, put them in so that they get tested like every other drug we take. This is something we're injecting into the veins of our little babies. We want it tested as rigorously as every drug everyone else takes in the world.
Dr. Wakefield, I'd like to give you the last words.
Yeah, I think people need to understand the seriousness of this issue, and we're at a critical juncture now in American history. I believe we face the end of the First Republic of the United States of America if we do not act in the interests of the citizens rather than the corporations. And I think that we need to make some very, very difficult decisions about this. We need to stop being afraid. We need to stop being intimidated by the CDC and the pharmaceutical industry. We need to see them for what they are, and we need to take responsibility. Individuals need to take responsibility for this. It's no good just saying, what can I do? I can't do anything, it's too big for me. The underbelly of this whole system is the public saying, no, we no longer have confidence in what you're saying. We will make the decisions about what goes into our bodies and the bodies of our children. That is our right.
Dr. Wakefield, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Del Bigtree, thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, in full disclosure, my children are vaccinated. I am not anti-vax. These gentlemen are not anti-vax. I have always supported a reasoned, mature, adult, all-American actual discussion on the safety of these products that we put into the bodies of our children and ourselves. And I've said it on this show many times, and it's still the truth. Our bodies, our spirits, our mind are sovereign. If they are not, then we belong to something else. Think about that. Regardless of which side of the issue you are on this, if you're a parent, if you're a doctor, if you're pro, if you're anti, all I ask you is to watch the film. Get informed. You don't know what you do not know. Our children deserve it. We deserve it. Our future deserves it. This is very important. My name is Michael Parker. This has been Antidote. As I tell you every week, stay optimistic, stay vigilant, because you, me, every single one of us, we're the antidote.
My phone rings, and it's Dr. William Thompson.
You and I don't know each other very well. You have a son with autism, and I have great shame now.
There's a whistleblower from the CDC who's going to come out and say that the CDC had committed fraud on the MMR study and that they knew that vaccines were actually causing autism.
My oldest son, Ian, was walking and running. After the vaccine, he was no longer able to do that.
So I called the clinic and I said, I think my child's had adverse reaction to those shots.
And then came the head bang, the constant banging against anything that he could find.
Right now, I'm sitting in a very pretty position in terms of providing you a lot of information.
The first thing that Thompson did was to plot a graph. Now, if there's no link between early MMR and autism, those two lines should track together. Now, they do track together until they get to 15 months. Then they separate, and they continue to separate thereafter. And they sliced and diced the data in an effort to get rid of that effect.
The relative risk of receiving an autism diagnosis was astronomical.
Wow. The CDC had known all along there was this MMR autism risk.
In CDC's judgment, the best public policy is to continue vaccination unchanged.
You who run our health agencies in this country, you have an obligation to make sure that these studies are complete, thorough, so that we have all the facts.
Oh my God, I cannot believe we did what we did. But we did.
Omission of crucial data, destruction of documents, misleading the Congress, grievous harm to innocent children.
Everything I've been telling my patients for the last 10 years has been based on a lie and a cover-up.
Parents should be able to count on federal agencies to tell them the truth.
In 1978, the prevalence of autism was about 1 in 15,000 children.
If we assume that things are going to continue as they have, we can predict that by 2032, 80% of the boys born will end up on the autism spectrum. Half the children, 80% of the boys.
It's a vast number of children who are being diagnosed with autism every day.
This is going to be a complete catastrophe if we just let it happen.